Hello and welcome back. My name is Jeff Carpenter. I am the founder of Dimensions of Heaven and Earth here in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I'd like to rejoin our discussion about the Templar spirit with a focus on locations. Location is going to become very important to our studies, to our sharing, as well as to the information that we know about what the Templars really contributed to the entire space of Europe. As some of the financial backers, as one of the first, if not the first, financial institutions for banking, where you could take a note, deposit your money in Paris in the Templary treasury, and go to, let's say, Jerusalem, and it would be honored by the Templar treasury there. You could take your money out. Obviously, there'd be some fees, but they also became a very powerful financial source, which many of you know then was some of the issues that they experienced towards the end of our alleged existence. I say alleged because there's a lot of the tradition that shows how it continued, even though, we'll talk a little bit about that today, even though the Templars were officially ended with the putting to death of the Grand Master Jacques de Molay. The location factors become very significant for not just where the Templars wanted to perform their rituals, perform their research, make friends with the mystics from around Europe and Middle East and Asia, but also privacy. I mean, let's go back and look at what took place. Through all of that work, in 1119, there finally become an official order, of which there are Hugh de Payen, Godfrey de Saint Omer, and maybe another 7 knights for years. Advance about 9 years, and we have some of the wars going on in the area of Portugal. The area of Portugal really starts to show us where we start to see that original area of war with the prince and the queen. Prince Alfonso and his mother, Queen of the Leon area, became embroiled in that war, and the Templars certainly were looking for the patience of Alfonso when they assisted him, and then finally, after years, they were given, as part of their reward, 1/3 of the space of Portugal. That's quite a lot for someone who just won that area. In fact, the first Portuguese Knights Templar castle was given to them in 1128 March, the castle of Suri. In Suri, they had already started building their first fortress, fortifying, looking at their new locations. But it's interesting to note that it wasn't until January of 1129, 9 months later, when the Council of Troyes in France, way over in France, then took place with Pope Honorius officially recognizing the Templars. By the way, the Pope wasn't there. He sent one of his magistrates. However, Hugh de Payen is the one to have petitioned for the council, and our great friend and now patron saint, Bernard de Clairvaux, was the one who convened it. He was already a friend of Pope Honorius because he helped in the institution as well as in the furthering of the church across Europe. So it's not coincidence that Bernard, who was also very close to the King Alfonso himself, was part of the entire process while the Templars were establishing and helping to establish the new nation state of Portugal. In Tomar of Portugal, as we continue our investigation of privacy, some of the most famous Templar constructions include the Convent of the Order of Christ. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, with the real coming down of, let's say, France as well as especially the church, on the Templars at that time, when you're all the way over and sitting in Portugal, from all the way from Rome, etc., It's very easy to then have the king, who will stand there and argue everything with you, change the name. So instead of the Knights Templar, the Poor Soldiers of Christ, it became the Order of Christ. And there's now the Convent of the Order of Christ, and the Templars could go about their business as before, continuing their builds, working on the different locations in Portugal. There's also the discussions that come around the Church of Santa Maria. This is the church that has been called by the Templar tradition the mother of all churches, dedicated to Mary Magdalene. If you remember in our discussion about the rule of where the Templars are supposed to do, where they're supposed to work, how they're supposed to behave in their tenets, that written by Bernard de Clairvaux, the Mary Magdalene approach is pretty evident when they are recognizing the sacred the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine, needing both for how that yin and yang, for how that approach is receive and send. How do you both come down and draw your divinity? How do you then exude and connect to it yourself? Many of that starts to come very aware. We become very, even when you're looking at the Templar rule and going through it, there are mostly, there might be a couple exceptions, but references, but mostly by name, there's three saints: Saint Peter, Saint Paul, and in the Templar naming, glorious Saint Mary Magdalene. You have that reference, but then you also have the Santa Maria de Olival church, which becomes the new Templar location for how then you start to create one of the most famous Templar buildings, the Rotunda in Tomar. We'll get to that in a minute. But when the king is giving 1/3 of all the Portugal they just won, in the Templar region, it's immediately created as the center. The center of the Templar region is now named Tamara, which is potentially a name of the daughter of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. As well as a name, if you look at the ancient connections they had to the Egyptians, to the Sufi, Tamara also refers to the resurrected Osiris. This was not accidental. Many of these approaches were then followed with confidence, comfort, and secrecy because it was time for the privacy. That whole Portuguese area where you couldn't really be much farther away from the church there and still be in Europe, still have connections to Jerusalem, still have connections to the Templar chapter house, which is pretty much the center of the power in Europe, in Paris, the one that was ripped down, the one that King Philip truly looked to rob, looked to steal all the money from after all the accusations against the Templars. There are still tunnels today underneath the cobblestones of the area in Paris, but we want to look at then the privacy, and following the privacy, the construction. The construction of the Templar places, the Templar facilities, often have purpose. They're there for a reason. Very much into sacred geometry because not just the alchemical process, which we've discussed, but also the feedback you get when your building, when your room is in the appropriate shape. You have correct, effective energy changes throughout the entire location. There's the process with all the actually foundations still sitting in Paris, where there's tunnels all over, but almost every Templar Grand Master comes from Paris. Comes from France. So France becomes the real focal point of the power, which is also why King Philip has such a challenge in France for this nation within the nation approach. Because if you remember the rule, the Templar rule discusses how the Templars will serve with a king and queen, not serve under them. The divine was the goal. And if the kings and queens were going to be the representation of the divine, that was great. But it still showed that the divinity comes from God and your free will determines how the Templar effectiveness is going to truly push the divine in the physical world. So we'll look at a few. The original Templar fortress in Acre. It was very popular as a seaport right next to Jerusalem. The Acre port was one of the last to fall in that final crusade before they were finally moved. They finally moved out of the area, the Templars. But it also was one created very specifically for Templar ease, but also Templar secrecy. We talked a little bit about privacy, but the Acre fortress, now effectively in the Palestine border limits, has 150 meters, and they were discovered later. They were filled in after the Templar fortress was torn down, destroyed by the Mamluks. The tunnels then have 150 meters from the docks on the shore to the Templar fortress directly. You need to bring treasure, you need to bring funding, you need to bring secrets or even large and undesired bits of information. Things you didn't want other people to notice. Large sets of troops would go through this tunnel so that the Templars would then be able to maintain that mystery of really not knowing what's there until the final downfall. And they used the tunnels to escape as well. In the Chapelle des Templiers in Metz, it's octagonal. If you want to look at the definition or the, as they say, the symbolism of the eight-sided piece, it's very much like the eight-sided cross, the cross of Malta, the eight-pointed cross that is often associated with the tradition. But the eight-sided approach in the building also meant for harmony, a readiness, an expectation to transform. How do you transmute your energies? How do you make sure that you are then honoring the foundations of sacred geometry with what your plans are? The Commanderia Libdo, instead, is rectangular. You'll find a lot of churches today have a rectangular shape. A lot of that is based on stability. The physical world, stability, but also the fact that you're looking to keep the energy in. You want to keep the raised vibrations inside. You want to absorb and store and let all that stuff bounce around in your rectangle as part of known sacred geometry purposes. But I think the most famous is probably that rotunda, the rotunda in Tomar. The rotunda where we know now that many of the brothers would have secret initiations, their most treasured rites, their most treasured rituals of the resurrection, as we discussed, where you'd be looking for 3 days in the astral or looking in the world of spirit. You'd be watched over usually by divine priestesses, because we're still uniting the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine. And then after 3 days, you'd be brought back and you would have a brand new consciousness. No different than many of the works in the symbolism of alchemy. But for this rotunda, it was so hidden, so important to the Templars. The Tomar area of Portugal is that important, that there's no door. There was a simple entrance found later, but there's no door, there's no altar, even though it was called a church. The entrance is in one of the floors that goes down through the hill, going down to the floor of the village, right into the mother of all churches. The Santa Maria Church, in its crypts, has the tunnel that starts to lead up, which starts to show the ascension of man leading towards their new resurrection. And the other direction in that tunnel, interestingly, goes to one of the unusual chapels to St. John the Baptist. So we start to truly understand the Templars looking to express themselves without all the judgment or even some of the persecution that they expected. Now finally, I'll talk a little bit about the third location factor, energy. If you are aware of a lot of the plans of lining up historical places across the globe, ley lines have become a big popular discussion probably since the 1800s. The 1980s. The ley lines are believed to be paths that connect these historic locations, those locations on purpose, connecting them to one another for specific functions, including things like the direction, which is supposed to be emulating some of the stars in the sky, where were they at specific times of the year, as well as the beliefs that at times you have ley lines that include the Earth's magnetic field. Where are the electromagnetic fields from the North and the South Pole on the planet generating these specific stronger concentrations of magnetism, lending to the energy and to the power of locations? We have all these opportunities for seeing locations that are lined up. We've talked about Stonehenge. We talk about the Egyptian pyramids. I'll leave it up to you, but I will say that we cannot underestimate the research that our tradition shows. We made friends with the Sufis, other mystics, the Kabbalah practitioners. We studied and shared their information, all looking back at potentially ancient philosophies and ancient societies, ancient cultures. So if we look at one of the big debates taking place, more because of a movie, I'm sure many of you will realize that we're talking about Rosslyn Chapel in the UK, right near Scotland, UK border area. Now, allegedly that was built in the 1400s by Sir William St. Clair. And the St. Clairs are known as one of the oldest families in the area. But with all the bas relief, the pictures, the faces, all of the, what some of the church people would call pagan symbols, faces, we have some inkling of what was taking place there and why that chapel at that time then was honoring many different kinds of beliefs if it was bringing together those kinds of practices. So using that, I'd like you to consider, before we close, the ley line itself that, if you want to map it, looks like it connects from Rosslyn Chapel down through the Templar Chapel in Trier, Germany, all the way to the little village in Greece called Delphi, as in the Oracle of Delphi. If you were a Templar architect and you had this knowledge, would you not want some of your most famous locations, your most popular locations, your most useful locations to then be linked energetically to other places that then you would draw power on? Even if, for those of you who are looking at the spirituality, even if you're looking at this as remote viewing, as remote connecting, drawing on that energy then starts to define and then support why we talk about location, location, location. Thank you for joining us today. Consider what we've talked about for why the Templars found the need for the privacy, for the need for energy, and their expertise in construction and shapes and knowledge and architecture, and what they were looking to preserve. When they change from the Knights Templar to, in Portugal, the Order of Christ, it's business as usual. What are we looking for today? How are we going to use our own locations to support us? How do we connect with the locations remotely that may be aligned, both spiritually and energetically, to our work? Take advantage of it, and I look forward to seeing you soon.